when Gadamer spent part of 5 years, almost 6 years at McMaster. So that's where I first started out
Mm-hmm.
and had quite an experience. I'll just give you one small anecdote. The first time I met Gadamer when I was very young, he said, study Greek, study Chinese, and get to Hawaii. And it took me 35 years to do that.
Oh, wow. Get to
Um,
Hawaii. So I understood the first two. What was the get to Hawaii about?
well, there is Chen Zhongying, who
Ah,
was the head of the
mhm.
surge for comparative philosophy in Hawaii. You had Chun Yuan and a few other people there. And Gadamer particularly liked Hawaii. And he had said to me that the path that I'm on is similar to Heidegger's. So you can help him out by getting to Hawaii, which was a nice thing. I
Yeah,
can tell people all about that as we get going.
that's a great story. All right. Well, welcome everybody. So this time we're going to be discussing the article on the natural inclination of human beings towards philosophy. And this was a talk he gave in 1971 as a recipient of I believe it's called the Reusch Prize. Am I saying this right? Let me look this up again. Um, the Reuchlin Prize, which is a prize for scholars in the humanities. And so it's a public talk and a general audience talk that then showed up in Reason in the Age of Science. It showed up first as an independent publication, and then later in Reason in the Age of Science, and a German version of that. That's all the background I have about it. Is there anything that someone is so excited to talk about? It would be a shame to wait any longer. So at this point, we should jump right on in and make sure we hit this topic because you just can't wait. Yes, Eddie.
Well, everything. I mean, I demand that every one of us should read this essay many times, and every single human being on this planet should read this. But if there's anything I wanted to point out, it's the part when he talks about self-understanding
Okay.
and how that is the crucial task of philosophy since the age of since the age of Plato and Aristotle, the pre-Socratics, all the way until today, and how it has now became, as it seems, our last resort against the elusive dominance and control of the natural sciences.
Okay. Yeah, great. And it strikes you that the focus on self-understanding is really what makes the difference between what philosophy can accomplish and what the natural sciences can't accomplish.
Yes,
Yeah.
and how that's supposed to be the core essence of the Geisteswissenschaften.
Mm,
But then Gadamer said, well, we badly need, as he says on page 149,
mhm.
here I see the challenge to authentic integration, to join together science and man's knowledge of himself in order to achieve a new understanding of humanity. We badly need this, for we live in a condition of ever-increasing self-estrangement, which far from being caused by the peculiarities of the capitalist economic order alone, is due rather to the dependence of our humanity upon that which we have built around ourselves as our civilization. And I think that's the
Yeah.
climatic point of the essay. That was when I said, wow, look at this.
Yeah. That's what it's been leading to. Everything else is leading to that idea.
Yeah.
All right, should we break this paragraph down then and just work through it a sentence at a time and see the ways in which the ideas unfold here? So it begins, no one would hold the opinion that in the face, I'm looking at page 149, in the face of these old questions, and he just ended with a long series of questions, and of that new orientation of science, philosophy should once again take over its old comprehensive function, and that it could integrate all our natural knowledge with a unified image of the world. So there's an old view of philosophy, right, as telling the grand story that puts all of our knowledge together into one cohesive whole. No one looks at philosophy to do that anymore. That really belongs to philosophy's past. But, and here's the title of the article, right? The natural inclination of human beings toward philosophy, toward the desire to know, prevails. Are we not still faced with the task of transposing ourselves into our practical consciousness, both for the knowledge of science, limited and provisional, or verified and efficacious as it may be, and all the knowledge of man that streams toward us out of the great historical tradition? So we have a contrast there between what science offers us and what the knowledge of man that streams toward us out of the great historical tradition offers us. And we are faced with the task of transposing into practical consciousness all of that. So making them practically present and function in our lives, both what science has to offer us and what the grand tradition of humanistic self-knowledge has to offer us. So that's what he says is the challenge of authentic integration, to join those two things together in order to achieve a kind of practical self-understanding. Does that seem right? Sort of walking through those ideas? All right, what do people think? Thanks, Eddie.
I think this is a nice counterposition to Heidegger, who seems to maintain much more of an antithetical relationship to modern science and technology. And Gadamer starts off that way, saying that we're lost in this age and we're overwhelmed with technology and its progress. And he's concluded, has been pointing out that they kind of belong together and that they should be integrated, as you just said. So I see that as kind of a significant difference with Heidegger.
Because Gadamer is giving science more credibility than Heidegger would?
Well, Heidegger tends to counterpose them and sort of set them off against each other, except when he talks about the Greeks. He talks about this rupture, right? So whenever he engages sort of modern science and technology, I guess he's thinking of the Greeks, but in contrast to them, there's always this grand sort of eruption, an event that breaks into the moment. And Gadamer's got this alongsideness, which, which stifles that or reconfigures it.
Mm-hmm. And do you find Gadamer's view more plausible than Heidegger's, Andrew? Where are you on this in this distinction?
Well, Gadamer has a two-world view in my reading, So Heidegger seems to, juxtapose or contrast the ancient Greek worldview with the modern in some sense. So I think I see more of a duality, you could say, in Heidegger, and much more of a confluence in Gadamer between the two worlds and interplay between them, but still they're at work.
Right. Yeah, good. That makes sense. Other thoughts on this key paragraph and these key ideas?
Find it
Yes. Henry.
I find it wanting to know a bit more because like he mentioned the need to join together science and man's knowledge at the end, because like in the middle of the essay I really feel like there's a lot of similarity between this piece and Heidegger's question concerning technology, but then at the end, like Gadamer did a turn, right? And then he suddenly said, okay, we need to join together, but he doesn't explain how or why, which I find a bit lacking. I think the only thing that kind of links together is like his use of the word Wissenschaft for philosophy, that kind of like have a semantic link between Naturwissenschaften and Geisteswissenschaften. But like this is like very surface level, so I wish he would develop that a bit more.
Yeah. Do you think part of it is just a popular talk, or do you think part of it is just Gadamer is just not going as deep into this topic as he could be? Hard to say. Okay, Don, you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Let me figure out how to lower my hand first.
Okay.
I tend to find, I don't know whether the word is ambivalence or contradiction seems to be kind of polemical, but there's some kind of tension in Gadamer. I mean, here he says this on page 149, which we've been speaking about joining together science and philosophy. Sounds very irenic, sounds very synthetic, sounds very agreeable. At the end of the essay on 150, he says, the Delphic oracle, know yourself, means know you're not a god, a cautionary note. And he ends it by saying, we need a warning before all illusions of mastery and domination. Self-knowledge alone is capable of saving a freedom threatened not only by all rulers, but much more by the domination and dependence that issue from everything we think we control. And this suddenly sounds like a warning against certain distortions of knowledge, fatal distortions of knowledge, things that will destroy our freedom. This sounds not nearly so accommodating. So which is it with Gadamer? I mean, is science something that's dangerous and we should be afraid of it and we should do everything we can to control it and it's out of control and it's killing us? Or is this something where we can find some accommodation where it's actually both of them are helpful, both of them are needed, and we wouldn't want to do without either one? I don't see that this is clearly resolved in Gadamer, and maybe it's his mood or something, but anyway, just.
And this sounds like something Henry is emphasizing too, the way in which this reads for a long way, like Heidegger, like real concern about the scientific framing of the world. And so at some points, it seems like science is a real threat for us, a threat to us. Our scientific mindset's a threat to our self-understanding and our freedom. And other times, he thinks the problem is just we get too carried away with it, think it can solve all our problems, and we just need to integrate it with. Right, this is, you say, the tension is he's not really clear about the dangers of science. Is that right, Don? I think you're muted. There you go.
Sorry. Yes, and in fact, earlier in the essay, he lists a whole series of ways in which people want science to control things in the human world, and it cannot do so and does not do so. And it's a very carefully thought out list of things, but science pretends to control politics, it pretends to control economics, and yet it fails in all of these because in fact it is not able to control these things. So he seems well, okay.
Yeah, no, I see that. That's good. Yes, Jay Goulding.
I was going to say, I joined the discussion already. I wish you guys were all up with me. I was going to pick up something that Andrew said that I think is quite correct. There's different views that that Gadamer has around the development of science than for Heidegger's era. What Heidegger grew up with is the original split of the Geisteswissenschaften and the Naturwissenschaften while studying with Heinrich Rickert. So I think there's something of the Entscheidung that is taking place here, that you're pulling something apart and you're gathering something together again. Heidegger's approach is on the Wissen as to what you could do with that, and then its relation to the Wesen. And I think we all pointed that out, that it's something interesting that Gadamer is saying there too. Again, there's a foreboding, but there is an anxiousness in some level to draw things together well, where he says, again on 149, that someone else had mentioned, the ever-increasing self-estrangement that we're getting.
Right.
So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you. John James, did you have your hand up? Oh no, it was John Garner.
Yes, I wanted to also to raise that issue of self-estrangement and exactly what he means there by the self-estrangement in the next line.
Mhm.
Because he's talking about the need to bring together science and man's knowledge of himself. Um, is that self-estrangement the scientific attitude per se? Is that the self-estranging attitude? Or is the self-estranging attitude the attitude that doesn't unify science with the human self-knowledge? Does you see the question?
Yeah.
I'm kind of curious which one that is. And it's probably, it may even be ambiguous, but
I was thinking it was the first one, right? It is the attitude towards science and the way we've sort of made science the core and maybe only legitimate source of knowledge and understanding. But maybe that also is the second one too. It's because we've elevated science in this way that we've precluded a possible integration because science doesn't have the tools for that sort of integration built into it. But I thought the self-estrangement came from creating a very scientific society.
but I could also see how that could preclude integration if that thrust is one to break down into parts and to analyze and to separate into discernible pieces without attempting a vision of the whole or something like that. I could see how that could contribute to an inability to glue itself together with something else. It won't stick together with anything else because it's always going to
Right.
partial.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, Don.
Uh, I'm going to just remark, and I have a sort of question about this. I hope others know. As long ago as before World War One, Josiah Royce wrote a book called The Problem of Christianity. And the gist of the book is that society has become so complicated that we cannot understand it. It escapes our understanding and therefore our control. And what we need is to think of a different way of being toward it. And what he proposes is the idea of an interpretive community. And I think he is the originator of that term. Now, I don't know whether Gadamer ever read Royce or knew anything about him, but there is a passage, and I'm sorry I can't give you the exact citation, so you're going to get my terrible paraphrase rather than Gadamer's ipsissimi verbi. And that is that Gadamer notes that the world we live in has become extremely complicated and we do not understand it. And the result is that people are furiously angry. And I think of my computer. I love my computer and I hate my computer because it is extremely complicated and constantly does things I don't know what it's doing or why or how to get out of it. And it's infuriating. And I think it's part of politics. People feel they are in a world which is extremely complicated, not in their interest, and there is nothing they can do about it. They can't sort of fight back. They've lost control. And in that sense, I think this is a profound political problem for him. It's not just a matter of sort of the epistemology of science or something. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. I can speak to the Royce part because I've sort of dabbled in hermeneutics and pragmatism. And when Gadamer talks about the pragmatists, he is always thinking of the instrumentalist tradition that you find in like Dewey and James that's focusing on practical problem solving as a generator for ideas. And he doesn't seem to have any connection to the more idealist tradition that you find in Royce, or maybe the more metaphysical tradition you find in Peirce. So his focus on the pragmatist is always the James and the Dewey, in the doing, in the problem solving, in the doing, our ideas transform themselves and become intelligible to us. Not if we take the stance of the community of interpreters, we see the way in which there is an understanding of things that brings everyone together in a greater picture, like we see in Royce. But yeah, I think that there are these existential fears going on here, right? It's not just an academic exercise about the limits of scientific understanding, right? He's really concerned about the ways in which scientific understanding has would you say that he thinks that the scientific understanding comes out of our natural inclination for philosophy and then turns into a distortion of it? Or would you say it sort of eclipses and puts aside our natural inclination toward philosophy?
Are you asking me?
I'm asking anybody, but sure.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Don, if you have an idea about that, I'd love to hear it. I'm trying to understand the relation between.
Well, I think,
Yeah.
I think one of the things that he talks about with science, there are two sides to the emergence of modern science in relation to what he calls Greek science. I don't like the word. I think that to call anything in Greek culture science is just a path to misunderstanding, because we know what science means, and it means that for us. And to say it isn't any of those things, it's something else that we're going to call science, just makes life horrible for the reader, you know. So modern science, on the one hand, gives up fundamental elements of Greek disciplined knowing. I want to translate episteme as disciplined knowing if we're going to do something here. It gives up the vision of the whole. It gives up a notion of getting to principles for the being of things qua being, in Aristotle's kind of strange phrase. It then does add some things. It adds things like the mathematicization of nature, and also the restriction of causes. Since science abandons, it doesn't follow the four causes that Aristotle discriminates. It abandons some of them. It's only interested in mechanical causes, and it's not interested in final causes. It doesn't do that. It doesn't go there. So I don't know whether one would say science abandons as much of Greek desire to know as it fulfills Greek desire to know. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, Henry.
I'm not sure if it is related, but like from what you said, David, it reminds me of on page 144 that he said like wonder. There are two aspects of wonder, right? Because like in the beginning he introduces like how philosophy was started with wonder, but on 144 he says that there are actually two aspects to it. One is just being astonished, and the other is having admiration, right? And he says the admiration part is kind of like the metaphysic baggage, which kind of transmitted into like the modern science, where the like modern science kind of like replaces the old metaphysics, and like maybe this could be like a path to kind of like know how the inclination for philosophy kind of turn into this kind of like impasse for us human. Maybe like these few pages, when I read it, it kind of reminds me of how Adorno saying like how the Enlightenment, the science, like it's still a myth without it itself knowing it is. So like I think it accumulates in around page 148, 147, how Gadamer is saying science like pretends to like solve all of our unpredictability, but it's not able to do so. So in a way, like science has not really replaced the so-called mythical metaphysics, but like our admiration just shift from the Aristotelian metaphysics into the modern science, which like actually inherited some of the characteristics. So in a way, like this has not escaped some of the problems that it thought, like I mean modern science has not actually escaped some of the problem it claimed to have solved. So maybe this is like one way of reading how like our inclination for like philosophy, we started with wonder, like this two way of like admiration and astonishment, like kind of bring us to this point today, right? So maybe we have like too much admiration and not enough astonishment.
Oh, interesting. Too much admiration and not enough astonishment. Where admiration means we're constantly looking for something good, something ideal, something that will answer the questions for us, something that will allow us to control things, something that will provide sort of a final clarity. Is that the idea? And so we've ported that all over to science to do that for us. And science can't and hasn't. Promises it, but
yeah,
hasn't lived
on
up to it.
yeah, and on 148 he says it, right? The authority of science and of experts adds up to relieving the responsibility that should be borne by the one acting. Like it is like we kind of divert of our responsibility to the experts, in this worldview. And this part kind of reads like Kant's what is enlightenment, right?
At some point I would love to just catalog all the ways in which Gadamer presents science as limited. So this is another one that science, I mean, we have, Don mentioned the reduction of the causes, right? So it puts aside all these other ways of understanding things and explaining things. We have science making all these promises in all areas, right? It promises a kind of universality in all these different areas of life, and then doesn't actually come through with it. It isn't reflective about its own prejudices, its own ways in which it's a kind of myth itself. What was the first one that Eddie mentioned? It doesn't provide self-understanding, right? And then this one is it becomes an excuse for us to abdicate our responsibility, right? We, instead of thinking it through, we just sort of defer to whatever science says is the best thing to do in this situation. Consider the expert, and then so we abdicate our responsibility. Does it all sound like things he says? I think I had 5 or 6 there. I hope somebody's writing this down. This should be worth. Yes, Eddie.
Regarding that, on the leaving responsibilities to science part, I do want to emphasize on the even more serious warning that he gave on 147 when he says the weather is constantly when he talks about all these things that science cannot resolve. But this state of affairs engenders the mounting expectation that science is ultimately capable of banishing all unpredictability from the life most proper to society by subjecting all spheres of human living to scientific control.
Yeah.
The first thought that came into my mind directly when I was reading this was, well, isn't this exactly what dogmatic metaphysics tried to do before Kant? Despite the different approaches and disciplines, don't they have the exact same telos to get rid of what is not predictable, what is not under control, and then sort of engulf every aspect of possible human knowledge under this one gigantic monstrous framework. And then we should not care about leaving this framework. We should not care about reflecting upon this framework. We should just, like those filthy naturalists,
Yeah.
do what science tells. Do what science tells. And that, I think, is pretty problematic in Gadamer's eyes.
Sure. That makes sense. Niall.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on Eddie's point there. I think it's a good one, filthy naturalists aside. As I see it, I think it would help us perhaps to bring, I think, the Gadamer discussion here closer to what Heidegger's talking about, specifically around the issue of, back to you, David, how science is limited. I think science is limited precisely because its scope is always around the controllable. So what is controllable is what the sciences are interested in. What is, let's say, in principle determinable, something like that, right? And he seems to start with this contrast, which I find interesting, between self-mastery and self-understanding. So the scientific inclination is in some way hubristic. It has this kind of this tendency towards mastery and domination, and that philosophy has a type of inbuilt buffer or resistance to that type of inclination. So there's a kind of a double inclination, I would say, in philosophy, and that's how I would link it to Eddie's last point. So within that Heideggerian discussion in the essence of technology, you have him saying that the essence of technology is nothing technological. Right? There's this well-known claim. So it's not really about technology, it's about an impulse in the human being, and we're constantly torn between that movement, which you could see also, you could see it in continental rationalism, that movement towards an account of the whole, a kind of a deterministic account of everything that occurs as controllable. So in some way, that's what you get in Heidegger. I think this idea that thinking, this other type of thinking, is not a thinking of the calculable. It's a reflection on the incalculable. What Gadamer doesn't say, though, is how philosophy itself has this double side, right? It's not like philosophy is not interested in the calculable. Its philosophy has always been interested in the calculable. He doesn't tend to say that. He sees philosophy as a kind of an inbuilt resistance to that kind of proclivity towards wanting mastery and domination over something. So I'm quite interested in that contrast between self-mastery and self-understanding. Is it simply self-understanding keeps its own finitude in front of itself, where self-mastery loses a sense of that finitude and suffers from a type of hubristic tendency towards an account of the whole? Is that the main difference?
Yeah, it's a great question. Self-mastery and self-understanding. Jay Goulding.
I was gonna again, I'm really enjoying the discussion. A lot of things occurred to me that hadn't occurred before in the discussion, as this passage on self-understanding beyond the peculiarities of capitalist economy and self-estrangement seems to me to be a Gadamer's commentary on Heidegger's Beiträge. Errance is bypassing the mystery. Freedom is openness to the mystery. So you get Gelassenheit and Verlassenheit together. He doesn't directly say this, Gadamer, but the way he takes it up is this idea of Entfremdung, Selbstentfremdung, which is a big term in Karl Marx, right? That we're alienated from our labor. What Gadamer says is that you can use that strangeness or alienation to bring back and basically put the question into the questioning and what he calls unquestioning. So anyway, I'll stop there, but I said all those things occurred to me. Gadamer likes to think between the lines, but he doesn't explain too plainly because he wants you to figure it out for yourself. So to me, a long time ago, I was very impressed by this passage because I wanted to get beyond this I'm alienated stuff. No, I'm estranged. Well, you're friends, enemies, and strangers. You can bring strangeness to a conversation and start joining that quest by looking at what has not been spoken. Now, also what a previous speaker was saying, this is something I've been working on recently, is the idea of calculative versus meditative thinking that you will see time and time again in Gadamer, also in Heidegger. But anyway, I'll stop.
No, that's all great. Glad you're here with us. John, Arthos.
Yeah. So this essay is in this book. These essays were collected and they were first in German in the mid 70s, and they're all around this theme, all one way or another. This becomes, as from my sense of things, this is really his great critique, his social political critique of modernity, right? Which is the technical, instrumental, managerial ambitions of science for a perfect society, And so I mean, he lists some of these things here, but these themes occur all through these essays, of this sort of desire for system and control and perfection. And I guess I'm with Eddie here. I do sort of wonder, and I sort of wonder why he isn't regarded more as sort of the prophet of the age that we're in now. He calls it the age of the expert, right? The age of technique. Um, and you know, for me, it's the age of the algorithm, right? And increasingly the age of artificial intelligence. Way that Google search is now going to use artificial intelligence to direct our searches towards, you know, clickbait and so forth. So, you know, now his critical argument against this sort of apotheosis of this bad kind of science is always it's two sides of the same coin, and the other side of the coin is sort of phronesis and humanist understanding, and the sort of the tradition that he wants to save, right, and bring back the Aristotelian and Platonic and Augustinian, and so he sees those always in contraposition to each other. But this theme, I mean, he really is, I mean, you know, when you think, I mean, if you think in terms of narratives, you know, genre narratives of sort of techno-noir, you know, Gattaca and Blade Runner and 2001 and all of those themes about the way that the technology takes over and directs us rather than we it. That's his great critical sort of critique of modernity, right? So I mean, so this is just one. This essay just addresses one side of it, but it's fundamental to his outlook.
Yep, that's great, John. John, what do you see as, I mean, we had two different perspectives of Gadamer's relation to Heidegger on this discussion of technology. One is that he's moving away from Heidegger, and one that we can still see deep Heideggerian themes here at work. Do you have a sense for how to place Gadamer with respect to Heidegger when he's talking about science and technology?
You know, I actually emailed Fred Lawrence. I was hoping he could show up because he was the translator editor of the English essay of the volume. And he starts out in his translator's introduction he starts with the 1961 correspondence between Leo Strauss and Gadamer. And the reason he does that is because he points to the place in Gadamer's letter where Gadamer is distinguishing himself from Heidegger's position. He says, where I will otherwise appeal to Heidegger in this attempt to think of understanding as an event is turned in an entirely different direction. My point of departure is not the complete forgetfulness of being, the night of being, but rather, I say this against Heidegger, the unreality of such an assertion. And so he's turning against Heidegger and Spengler and the eclipse of God and all that. And so I think Fred is saying here that this dialogue between Jerusalem and Athens, as he puts it, is still going on between the ancients and the moderns.
Still alive in Gadamer. Yeah. Good. Thanks. Well, number of things have been brought up and are still live on the table, as far as I can tell. If someone would like to weigh in, Eddie, go right ahead.
Short point. Regarding Dr. Arthos on the prophet, Gadamer as the prophet part, on page 147, I think he captures well what he says. Then there's the scientific problem posed by economy and prosperity, which we expect economics to bring under control, and fails. There is the problem of linguistic consensus. So the kind of, again, the naturalist, ordinary language, Wittgensteinian stuff among human beings. Not only there's the problem of the linguistic consensus among human beings. Not only the multitude of languages men speak, but also the inexactitude in the usage of each language, and all the problems of understanding and miscomprehension are supposed to be resolved by a new scientific control over language in general, by its rational construction and organization. And I think one of the basic premises coming from that post-structuralist condition tradition towards psychoanalysis, hermeneutics, is that there's always going to be leftovers when it comes to communication and language and the use of linguistic frameworks. There's never going to be a point where that kind of grand, vast, total understanding is possible. But then I then thought, okay, I've recently read news about Elon Musk and that stupid thing where you can connect brain wires between brains. And then I was thinking, well, isn't that exactly what scientists in our days tries to do? To resolve the so-called miscomprehensions and misunderstandings in the multitude of language and the inexactitudes by just connecting wires between brains. But in fact, I think Gadamer is wonderful in Truth and Method, pointing out that it is exactly the inexactitude, the impossibility for full-scale understanding, and the always existing miscomprehension that leads to the fusion of horizons, that leads to what's beyond our horizons and our capabilities. That's just, yeah. And I think Gadamer obviously didn't know who Elon Musk was, I think. But I think he made this really great prophecy in propheticizing what would have happened at our present contemporary time.
So you feel like 50 years later now, 53 years later, in hindsight, Gadamer had the right idea. This turns out to have borne out over time and held up?
For better or for worse.
For worse. Got it. Good. Very good. One thing I'm interested in, I don't know if others are interested in this, but it's on page 146, where he talks about it's the last sentence of the first full paragraph. And he says, it's no exaggeration to say that we find the great novels of the 19th and 20th centuries, together with the other kinds of artworks from this epoch of bourgeois culture, closer to the old tasks of philosophy, and we look upon them as the custodians of philosophy's great heritage. So one question I had is, to what extent can novels, artworks provide the kinds of resources for self-understanding that he is suggesting philosophy is supposed to do, or our inclination to philosophy takes care of, or that science is marginalizing? I was wondering what the relationship was between artworks doing these kinds of things and philosophy doing this kind of thing. I don't know if anyone noticed that or had thoughts about that. Yep. Yes, John, Arthos.
Yeah, I mean, he's always reminding us that that's the tradition out of which he comes, right? Literature, art. I mean, look how he starts Truth and Method, right? Poetry, you know, Ricoeur was always remarking at how Gadamer would recite whole poems, and he comes out of that tradition, out of the artes liberales, you know, the Studia Humanitatis, the great bodies of literature, and he meant that in the broadest possible sense, is where he thinks truth arises, right? And so it's the generative ambiguity that Eddie's talking about, right? People would often criticize him. I remember I just read Philip Forget taking him to task for being unclear and ambiguous, but he was cultivating that intentionally. It wasn't a mistake, right? He was trying to get the music of his voice. He talked about the music of his voice to reflect the kind of truth that he was interested, which is not this kind of reductive, mathematized, absolutely, clear and distinct kind of scientific knowledge. He thinks that that's true, useful knowledge, productive, all useful in all kinds of ways, instrumentally, but ultimately, at the end of the day, it has to be subordinated to judgment, to human judgment and experience, and the knowledge that we suffer, is the way he puts it. So it's this coming out of this very humane, he's trying to resurrect the value of the humanities, which is again why I think, why isn't he more raised up now these days when we're losing the humanities? I mean, the humanities are shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And so he is really the person who speaks to that the most eloquently.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, Don.
Yeah, I wanted to say, I think we lost the game when we called artificial intelligence. It isn't any kind of intelligence. It's completely different from anything we think of as intelligence. What this computer does with its vast data sets and its statistical methods. This is the relation to that is the difference between, this is where totality comes in. He keeps insisting that to speak a language, you live in the totality of the language. And that's why there's ambiguity, because the infinitude of what isn't said together with what is said constitutes communication. And against that, we have the communication model of language with two heads and a little wave and a picture of a tree inside one head and a tree inside the other head and the tree floating, it sort of drives me crazy. But there is this attack on it, which on 147, and this is where I'd be interested in John Arthur's reaction, where he starts the page. Today, in fact, in the age of a new radicalized faith in science, the role of art in society is just as contested as the interest in the historical tradition of all of these strange things. It is this peculiar sense that science erodes our very appreciation of art, our very openness to the past and to history, and turns us toward a future which we fantasize controlling. And all of the past that's just all that dead and gone stuff. Who cares about that? Why would anyone want to read a 19th century novel, for God's sake? The 19th gone, I think I'm putting it more strongly than he does, but I think he means it when he says science actually erodes, it corrodes the capacity we have to respond to art, to poetry, to history, to the whole of human culture. So it's again a tension in him that I don't see resolved.
Yeah, thanks, John. Niall.
I'm slightly concerned about. I'm slightly unsure about what he means the old tasks of philosophy exactly, because he's contrasting this good thing with a seemingly less good thing. But the history of philosophy has been as interested in calculation and the eternal and the immortal as it has been by the contingent or the changeable. So I mean, I think he's in some way exaggerating the specificity of philosophy in some way, or the old task of philosophy. I mean, he could have equally said the natural inclination toward philosophy is as much about the immortal or the eternal or the objective or the calculable or the fixable as it is about. I mean, if one reads Aristotle's Ethics, for example, calculability is a fundamental aspect of how we go about our reasonings. So, I mean, Don is right. When you talk about episteme and you call it science, they're not the same thing. I agree. But philosophy has always had this natural proclivity towards grasping, apprehending, conceiving, determining, fixing. It's not as if philosophy is exempt from this scientific leaning itself, right? Am I wrong-headed in thinking that?
No, that seems right. That's why I started to wonder whether he sees the rise of science as an expression of our natural inclination, but then that turned out to be limiting. So it comes out of our natural inclination toward philosophy to make sense of things, to clarify things, to tell a story about things, to find some deep explanation of things. But then it turns out to, since it's focused on control, for example, it precludes some of the important things that our inclination of philosophy is trying to achieve.
But your reference to the novels, the novels of the 19th century and the old tasks of philosophy, that makes it sound in some way that philosophy has this old task that it fell away from, or if you're right. And that I think is a bit too monochromatic in defining philosophy's task.
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying. Just a second, John, I want to welcome John Beach and Eric, I think, showed up. I'm sure this was my fault. There was ambiguity in emails where some places said 2 o'clock and some places said 3 o'clock, but I'm glad you finally joined us. John Arthos, go right ahead.
Yeah, I did. So these words that he uses, philosophy and science, and he gets in trouble for this a lot, right? Because he when he says those things, he can mean them in a different way depending on the context, right? So, and I'll recommend the very last essay in the collected volume on education, poetry, and history is called Citizens of Two Worlds, and he goes through the history of this, and it's the clearest explanation I've found that he gives. So he finds the kernel of the problem with the Greeks, right? Because he says, Parmenides separates substance from language. And that separation, that dualism is going to bedevil the West for the rest of history, right? And so what happens is, he says, in the 17th century, the age of reason, that dualism becomes accelerated, right? So he can, when he says the Greeks, it's the same kind of ambiguity. He has this deep ambivalence. He loves and hates what they did, right? Because they gave us reason, they gave us logos, and this sort of very potent power, right, has this ability to go in either direction. But modernity took it and went in one direction, right? And so you have to kind of read his use of these terms like science and truth and knowledge and in there, you have to contextualize. What is he referring to here? Is he talking about this positive sense of the Greeks or the negative sense of the Greeks?
Thanks, John. One question I had, I'd love to get back to these other things, but one question I had is whether Gadamer thinks, if we have a natural inclination to philosophy, that philosophy was in some sense destined to develop in the species at some time. I tend to think of sort of Socrates as that moment is a contingent moment in the history of our species, and we're working in the heritage of Socrates, a transformative moment. But if we have a natural inclination to philosophy, then maybe he thinks that it was only a matter of time before we took up this sort of intellectual pursuit. That was one of the things I was curious about. But also then it leads to questions about the story of the development of science. When you talked about just now, John Arthos, about whether this is something they felt like had to play out in this way. It seems like he's suggesting with modernity, it took a shift, it didn't have to. But I wonder if there's a natural inclination here, to what extent did things have to unfold in a certain way? But okay, John Beach, welcome.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry.
No, it's my fault.
That's all right. I was just struck. I wondered what John Arthos, what you meant by the negative sense of the Greeks. I'll just sort of premise it with that, because I'm not sure what you're referring to. And the other thing is the science, here's a real analogy. Here's a real sort of crazy analogy. Okay, you have this up until the 17th century, there is a unified vision, and philosophy is still the queen of the sciences up until the 17th century. And then you have, the so-called scientific revolution, which nobody really knows what it was, but what the essence of it is, because science is split into a million different things. Mechanics is not just wasn't just classical mechanics that happened. But anyway, you have a new guy on the block, and this guy is science, and all of a sudden he's taken over the whole city. It's not just the territory that you had, but he wants to control it all. And Gadamer is saying, wait a minute, these guys have to stay within their territory, their boundary. They can't be controlling our territory too. And I think that's what I think one simple way of looking at what Gadamer is saying.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, Don Marshall.
I appreciate John Arthur's comment. I just wanted to add that Gadamer seems, I'll put it this way, he is very concerned to liberate Plato from Neoplatonic interpretations of Plato.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, I think he is also very concerned to liberate Aristotle from scholastic interpretations of Aristotle. And the thrust of it seems to be that once you remove these encrustations, the Greeks look completely different. And what they say is completely different. And what they say is something we desperately need to hear. So I agree that he has a kind of ambivalence toward the Greeks, and possibly it's even deeper than that. But it's certainly an ambivalence between even Aristotle and what has been made of Aristotle, the kind of rigid system building that has been imposed on Aristotle and Aristotelian philosophy, and that has reduced the openness of Platonic dialectic and dialogue, and also Aristotle's way of thinking, which is not rigidly systematic, in fact. Yeah. Okay. That's it.
Yep. Thanks. Yes, Eddie.
I would like to ask Dr. Beach when he mentions the boundary part, do you think it's the task of hermeneutics, in a sense, to set the boundaries and territories for the natural sciences? Should hermeneutics, Gadamer, and all the humanitarian people assign a territory for the natural sciences so that they
No.
do not go beyond where they should be?
No, I mean, Gadamer wouldn't say that. He was saying we're not to preach to the scientists and tell them what to do, but they're not even they shouldn't be. I mean, if we think that they have some hegemony over us, then we don't know what it is that we're doing. We don't understand what philosophy is. We've lost it. But that's not scientists can't really help us there. But I mean, science is going to happen on its own. It's on its own power, and that's fine. That's good. There's nothing wrong with that. A thing is, I mean, they do kind of get high on their own supply, to use another analogy, and that's why we're destroying ourselves very rapidly, and we don't have the deadline to human history is rapidly approaching. But it's not that it's because we've let it down, because we haven't, we've totally failed to understand what the Greeks are saying. And I still want to hear what's negative. I mean, sure, this from Gadamer, sure, there's lots of stuff from Heidegger that's negative, but I don't see anything from Gadamer. I want want to hear what that is about the Greeks.
We've triggered John by saying the negative. So, John Arthos, do you want to say something about that? Just so we're...
Yeah, John, I want to reassure you, right? I mean, Gadamer said, Gadamer, when they ask him, is he a Platonist or Hegelian? He said, absolutely, I'm with Plato, right? And Aristotle, and he reads them together, and so I'm not trying to challenge your basic.
No, but what's negative? What's
Okay,
this negative
so-
stuff that comes
Right.
from
No,
the
it
Greeks?
happens quite a bit because I'll read you from him, okay? From the essay I just mentioned, but it happens in a lot of places that he doesn't have any illusions, right? So for example, he says, he's talking about, I mentioned to you about Mathemata and Parmenides. He says, and it is this concept of logos which fundamentally determined the Greek concept of science, to be able to be answerable for, to be able to be accountable for, to justify, and to prove. All of these are implied in the logic of the Greeks. In addition, the central expression for the sciences used by the Greeks was ta mathemata. And then later on, he goes, the emphasis of this concept of the subject as the stable basis of changing predications and assertions is what characterized. He's saying that is the kernel of the thing that later on became this hard dualism in this rationalized notion, this Cartesian world, this dualist world of the 17th century, and then later in the 19th, 20th century, this hyper-rationalization of society itself, right? So he's saying that there was you could probably find a myth that would talk, well, I mean, the apple in the Garden of Eden, where this thing was born in Greece and became deformed in modernity.
Okay, you just froze at the precise point where I think you were at where that kernel was. What was that kernel again?
Oh, did I freeze? Did my screen freeze?
Yeah, you did
Yeah.
freeze quickly there.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, so did you hear what I read from him?
Yeah, and I didn't see any. I didn't get the point from that. But go ahead.
Yeah. This idea of the ideal form as the perfect expression of the idea, right, which can be translated into mathematics, and this separation of Hule, of substance, right, of the substance from the various ways we can describe that substance with language, right? I mean, you can even find that sort of theory vestigially in some of the dialogues, right, of this idea, and he talks about that in Truth and Method, right? And that's one of the places in Truth and Method where he takes Plato to task, right? So go back and read in the third part of Truth and Method, where he talks about the Cratylus just before he turns to Augustine, and he says Augustine had this very rich idea of the inner word, which sort of saves Western logical thought from this dualism, right? Because the word is embodied, and he uses the example of the Christ, the incarnate word, right? So that kind of embodiment saves us from the kind of dualism that unfortunately was planted as a seed in Greek thought.
Where was it planted?
Well, right here is where he talks about when Parmenides talks about essence.
Parmenides talks about what?
Essence.
Parmenides doesn't
idea.
talk about essence, really.
The ideal. Parmenides, the dualist world of the ideas and the forms, as opposed to the imperfect.
Okay, see, that's not Gadamer at all. Gadamer does not see a dualist word in Plato or in Parmenides, I'm afraid. This is the theory of forms. This is Neoplatonism. That's where my problem is.
Okay, I want to bring this back to Megan. I know has been waiting very patiently for a while here.
But
Megan,
Plato was not an idealist.
You want to get back
in Gadamer's view.
in Megan? Megan, are you there?
Uh,
Megan Altman?
yeah, I'm here. Yeah,
Okay.
hi. Hi. It's a non sequitur though. So
That's fine. This is a rabbit hole
Um,
that we could spend the next 40 minutes on, so it's okay.
Actually, thanks. Yeah, to circle back to the passage David highlighted in the topic of art. My question for the group is not fully formulated, so please let me know if it doesn't make sense. I'm thinking about I'm glad you brought that passage up, David, because I was struck by that one, and I was trying to connect the threads, right, in this essay between philosophy and art and meaning. And I think something that might be missing that I didn't see, that at least for me, right, is truth. And right, how for both Gadamer and Heidegger, right, a work of art is an event of truth and the emerging into presence of truth. And yeah, I'm wondering what to make of that in light of what he says here and why truth is, where's truth? Yeah.
Is it your sense that he's sort of giving truth over to science and then saying there's more to life than truth? We have art. Is
I
that
don't know,
the
because
feeling?
right, like, because I'm not a Gadamer expert, but just in Gadamer's other works that I'm familiar with, and then also I'm much more familiar with Heidegger. But I think that they agree that the work of art, right, is the work of truth, and it's embedded in a community, and right, that historical hermeneutical embeddedness, right, is part of that event, the unfolding, right? It's an unfolding event in which truth is made manifested and realized, right?
Mhm.
And so I think that's got to be what philosophy is doing. And I just, maybe it's here in the essay that we read for today and I just missed it.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Does someone want to speak to that? Eric, is your hand up on that topic or something else? Something else. I mean, what you said sounds exactly right. And I think that's his view, even if it's not explicit here. I would say too that there is the self-understanding part as well. Not only is there a truth, but there's a truth about yourself that comes to the fore in art and in philosophy. That's really relevant for him, that I think he thinks science doesn't take seriously, or doesn't occur in science, or if it occurs in science, it occurs in a very different kind of way that isn't a full self-understanding. I think Niall distinguished self-mastery from self-understanding earlier. Niall, did you want to get in on this? I saw your hand come
Yeah,
up.
I think that's a great point. I mean, I think, yeah, Megan, you put into words there's two concepts of science, I would say. So the old task of philosophy is not anti-scientific. They're both concerned with truth, right? So, but truth is neither factual truth, nor is it ideality in any way, but something that exists historically in time. It's about the contingent, historical, the particular, but it's about what Gadamer calls the truth of the word. Right? So the truth of the word is truthfulness or truth coming to expression in the word, as opposed to truth as something which is determinable or fixable or factual or merely factual. But I think Gadamer is in some way wrestling with those two concepts. So I think what he means by the old task of philosophy, or is that the old task? Is that the reference? Is simply that Platonic Socratic one of holding the questionability of its own position in front of itself as it seeks some sort of analysis of truth, and tempering itself against hubris, right? That sense of thinking we're gods. So it's the good science versus the bad science, I would say. It's not like philosophy against science, but it's within philosophy, there are two concepts of scientific thinking. I mean, scientific thinking for me doesn't begin with modernity. It reaches an apex with modernity, but it's there in the Greeks. It's not non-Greek. It's there in medieval philosophy. It's there in Neoplatonism. So I just think we need to be careful against this idea that something happens in modernity and everything gets lost. And now Gadamer is coming along trying to clean things up a little bit. I think in this sense, I'm kind of with Heidegger that there is a story that metaphysics itself is necessarily scientific in a certain sense of scientific, and that we can't whitewash that. We can't like say philosophy is metaphysics, and philosophy is kind of has this non-scientific approach that would give us an awareness of the changeable and the contingent. It has this doubleness to it. So in that sense, I would disagree with John. I think there is a strong, I think John was talking with the Greeks there in very laudatory terms. I think Gadamer is right to talk about them in that way, but he's sometimes papers over the fact that, you know, I agree with John Arthos in that sense, that there's some type of objectivity that the Greeks were also after, and that was scientifically determinable. First philosophy, right? Metaphysics is first philosophy. The ethics is not first philosophy, it's the metaphysics. It's the superior science. And that's not unimportant, I think, or negligible.
Does that help, Megan? Yeah. You know, one thing I've been wondering, and it takes a little farther, when he talks about art playing this role of satisfying natural inclination of philosophy, I started to wonder, well, what do we need philosophy for then? Is art enough? And I think what you said, Niall, by saying philosophy has this scientific spirit built into it from the start, suggests that if the goal is to integrate, then only philosophy could do the integration, because philosophy has the recognition of the value of science as well as the kind of self-understanding that arises through the arts. Does that make sense?
I mean, there is very briefly, there is this discussion in Heidegger between thinking and poetizing. So thinking is not poetizing and philosophy is not poetry, but thinking must draw itself close to the spirit of poetizing to recognize something of its own blocked potential, right? That if philosophy has this blocked potential, that's partly metaphysical. So it can learn something by kind of mirroring the spirit of poetizing without becoming poetry. And in that way, Heidegger's not romantic. He doesn't want philosophy like the romantics to become poetry. He wants philosophy to become thinking, which is not poetizing.
Okay. Yeah, good. Thanks. Eric, you've been waiting very patiently.
I think I'm going to still wait because John raised his hand while Niall was speaking. So let's just.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, John, do you have a reply to that?
Yeah, because I wasn't
exactly.
here, so I'm just going to be interrupting with what I bring up. So
okay, John
keep
Veach.
rolling.
I'm going to have to ask you to unmute.
Gadamer is very careful about not criticizing Heidegger. One may not think that, but I think he really is, because this is what the view that John Arthos was mentioning and that Niall supported. That's very Heidegger. Heidegger thinks, that science, the problem with modern science began with the Greeks in kernel form, absolutely, and that's why we need a new beginning, and so on. The thing is, Gadamer doesn't see that. Gadamer quite clearly says there's something in Plato that Heidegger never saw, and he's very explicit about that. And that is, and I think that Don was mentioning it earlier, that the openness of dialectic in Plato. There's no sort of kernel of subjectivism and this is a big difference between in Plato. There's a big difference between Heidegger and Gadamer, because Heidegger also says there was no such thing as an object before Descartes. It wasn't possible. He says this over and over again in his later stuff, but yet he still wants to go with Nietzsche and put it back with Socrates and Plato. But so Gadamer, and that's why Heidegger mocked, or Nietzsche mocked a Geput at the end of Heidegger's life. But there is Gadamer will concede that Aristotle does correct Plato and refine Plato's view totally to a certain extent. But again, he does not take Aristotle's interpretation of Plato as having a theory of forms, of having a separate. He thinks Aristotle's totally wrong about that, and Aristotle knows that because he's arguing to defend his concept of physis. Whenever he mentions physis, it's always a criticism of Plato, and so you mean that changed everything too. So I haven't been. I mean, I'd love to talk with anybody, dialogue privately with anybody about this, because it takes us right to the center of the difference between Gadamer and Heidegger. And I think that we're accusing Gadamer, or we're seeing Gadamer as holding some views that Heidegger held in this regard concerning Plato and science and metaphysics.
Okay, thanks, John.
Okay.
Now,
All right, you're up, Eric.
No. Now
Oh?
you raised your hand during John, so I know it's still on
defer
that.
forever. Okay, Niall is on this topic.
I just wanted a briefly, and then we can move to you. I think this claim by Gadamer, he says you cannot be for or against Heidegger. You cannot circumvent thinking in such a simple way. So this idea of the for or against, I don't understand. I think he's wise to say that.
Yes.
Because you have this type of thinking with an inner resistance to. The only resistance I find is he's trying to take these Heideggerian insights, which he subscribes to, and find them already in Plato. I think that's the resistance. I think this idea that Plato has a tendency to make sure that philosophy doesn't run away with itself, that it focuses on finitude, that he doesn't agree with Heidegger's reading of Plato, but he tries to find all of those radical Heideggerian insights already in Plato, where Heidegger doesn't want to find those insights in some way, right? But apart from that, I don't think there's an against or a for. And I think he's wise to try to think kind of in that, as he calls himself with Hegel, doesn't he, a tension-filled proximity. So there's also this tension-filled proximity with Heidegger, but not for or against, or away or towards.
Okay, Eric.
Okay,
No longer.
All right, thank you. So I've got three. So this is right. Like usually when we start, you always say like, what are the three topics that we want to, or what are some topics that people really need to talk about? And so there was three for me. I'll just mention all three, and maybe somebody will want to run with one of them. But I'm going to put them in the chat too.
Okay.
Logos versus mythos. Okay. And then there's this article by Bruce Lincoln that I'm attaching. Okay, so the first thing that I think about with this article, and then always just even teaching Gadamer, is that I'm worried about the audience, these students that are, right, they're living under the conditions of like anti-science in the sense of anti-vax, right, climate change denialism, right, this sort of thinking about science in their lives. So when I point out Gadamer's criticisms or qualifications of the natural sciences, I'm always worried about the reception of that, because I feel like I don't want the students to run with it in such a way that it confirms their like anti-vax position or something, right? So there's that kind of rub that happens. And then the second thing I wanted to talk about is, and there were some folks tweeting about this recently, about the pressure on humanities classes to be easy because the science classes are the hard ones, right? Like that there's this genuine pressure on humanities programs to like make their classes easier. There's this pressure by administrators, pressure by science faculty, and pressure by students themselves that they expect to get an easy A in an English class, but are comfortable with the F in their chemistry class or something. Okay, that's the second thing. So when the reason why I'm bringing up that one is with regard to what Gadamer's saying here, that there's still this kind of, and you guys were already talking about it when I got on, the tension between the humanities and the sciences, but I'm thinking of it in college institutions, right? Like how does it play out? Then the last thing is, and this is on page 142, where he's referencing Heraclitus, Parmenides, right? And then he says, is established in contrast with all the opinionated knowingness. And this happens under the new claim of logos, or reason joining everyone together, raising everything to communicative clarity. So Bruce Lincoln has this article where he's looking at the historical development of mythos and logos and trying to highlight how, if we look carefully statistically at their uses in like data analysis of the uses of these terms in the Hesiod, the the Odyssey, whatever, that mythos has a masculine kind of association of authoritative discourse, and that logos before Plato was actually like considered feminine, and that it was what women did. And then somehow Plato and Socrates were able to culturally appropriate women's discourse to make it philosophy. Like, this is kind of the argument that Lincoln is making in this. And so, you know, when I'm reading Gadamer here, I'm kind of missing that component that I think, right, is an interesting kind of twist on it, knowing that he has like his dismissal of feminism and stuff like that, right? Like, right, that it's almost like passing over the gendered quality of these competing discourse styles, passing over it in silence. So I wanted to bring it up, right? So this like the logos allows for communicative clarity. And it's like, so you're saying that women's gossip is actually better for philosophy than, right, the declaration of the oracle to make definitive statements. And I don't know, maybe it's irrelevant.
I don't know if it's irrelevant. That seems to be a very deflationary end, Eric, after bringing all these things up. Yeah, I've read that piece too, and I think maybe it's because you sent it to us before, or maybe we've just talked about it. But it does have this great idea that there's something unmanly in the idea of, well, let's just talk it out. If we disagree, well, we just need to talk about it some more, right? Which is this classic idea of the logos, as opposed to we take up our swords and one of us wins, and that's how we settle disputes, right? But they're also, and then with Plato and Aristotle and philosophy early on, you get this idea that, yes, putting it into words is actually the ways in which you can solve things once and for all, right? So that becomes the elevated approach. And then with it, a kind of metaphysics that by putting into the words, we're now tapping into the order of things, right? That language has a connection to the order of things. I think that's certainly part of Gadamer's story about the ancient world, and the way that then that inspired a certain kind of natural science later on.
Yeah, and I think the way you put it is kind of right, to add to that the relationship between the kind of appropriation of the logos for masculinity is that, like, in as much as talking it out is exploratory, that it has the fundamental relation to the quote unquote scientific method, right? The like, it's always provisional, it's always ready for revision, right? Like, given more data, we can always revise in light. And so maybe that's, and you guys probably talked about it already. I'm sorry to be a broken record.
I don't know. The first one's interesting, teaching Gadamer in the area of anti-science. One thing I asked Eddie is whether he thought that 50 years on, Gadamer's predictions, Gadamer's analysis seems to have held true. And I too wondered about sort of his suggestion that science itself has its own hidden dogmas, and the way people today will talk about science itself as a kind of religion. And since it's a kind of religion, if it's not my faith, then I don't have to follow it. Kind of, which so always the next step, right? And then I wonder whether the faith that he talks about in science really is as strongly held today as it was maybe 50 years ago. But then we don't want, but the argument, yeah, so I don't know. Isn't he anti-science in that sense? Isn't he saying science makes all
Just that it's ambiguous enough that, like, even mentioning it in front of an audience prepared to be anti-science, they can just proof text Gadamer and take quotations out of context and go see Gadamer's with me, because look at all the anti-science that shows up in what he's saying.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, I should be clear. Eddie did say yes. Eddie said yes, that Gadamer was on the right track. And I was suggesting that the anti-science spirit of the day may be not yes. But okay, John Beach, yes, thanks for waiting.
Yeah, I think I mean, there was some amazing science that was done in the Greeks and even in the Hellenistic period, when basically philosophy, except for ethics and political thought, stopped, never progressed beyond Aristotle. The science was in the Hellenistic period was amazing, and stuff that happened in Alexander and stuff like that, Alexandria. And but so I don't see. I mean, there's no real anti-science that I see in Gadamer. But what I find, what I struggled with, is what is it that with Galileo and Descartes, God and Gadamer sometimes, God, Galileo, come Descartes, or slash whatever. What is it there that really affected our understanding of the whole, and understanding of the world, and understanding of philosophy? And I think one of the things is that, and this is where Gadamer and Heidegger are in complete agreement, is the rise of sort of modern subjectivism. And so that's really what's changed, and that's what's, then that we have become gods. That's why he says at the end of this paper, know thyself means know that you're not a god. And this is the problem that we've this is where I think Plato, this is the point he makes about Plato. Plato says, well, wait a minute, philosophy isn't just, like as Anaximenes said, it's just, watching the stars and, being an this, no, it's not. This is that Aristotle, talks about that. It's constantly questioning, never really knowing ultimately, but being open all the time. And this is something that Gadamer thinks constitutes the center of philosophy then and the center of philosophy today. And it has not changed, and it has not, and science will not alter it. Science cannot touch that. And we haven't, we should, and that's what hermeneutics is essentially too. It's not like you get together maybe to solve something, not, forever, but you reach an agreement but it's, it can always be opened up. It's not like you're going to, sort of eliminate the Arab violence against the Jews forever, kill them all, exterminate them. That'll be the final solution. It's not that. I mean, you don't do these things forever. But so I think that Gadamer saw this in Plato, and he got open, and that's why dialectic is still at the heart of philosophy today. And do we believe in it? Do we believe in the power of it? Maybe we don't. Maybe we don't think that philosophy really does exist, or we talk about realism. Is that just positivism? Is that just a fad? What is it? What is realism? Gadamer says it's a suspect philosophical term. Anyway, that's my rant.
All right, thanks, John. So I'm wondering if there's a very specific understanding of philosophy here that Gadamer has in mind, because it seems like perhaps some forms of philosophy that are, philosophy is an incredibly diverse place, historically, globally, currently. There's a lot of different sort of intellectual activities that happen under the umbrella of philosophy. And it seems like some of those he might think still belong to the tradition of mastery and control, that sort of, it shares the values with science that maybe do not fulfill our natural inclinations, where others, I talked earlier about a kind of poetic thinking, might serve the role. I was wondering if people had thoughts about that.
I do, but if somebody else wants to go.
You're up, Eric.
Oh, well, for me, it connects with what you were saying earlier about art too. Like, to me, his emphasis on art can also overlap with now, like what you're saying about poiesis or the poetic dimension, right? So that in all embodiment of the logos, it's always going to have the sensuality component to it, and that's the materiality of it, right? And so art works, the plastic arts, the poetic arts, right? Like just thinking of poiesis as the worded artistry, right? Like so that's what I was going to add to what you were saying.
Yeah, good. That makes sense. I like that phrase, worded artistry. Yeah, poetics.
Okay, and just to keep riffing with that, and that I think that's where the tension comes in, because this is what I'm trying to get at with students reading Gadamer wrong, because this element of you have an audience that's primed to be anti-science, and so any mention, they're already kind of off track because they're not reading Gadamer. What they're doing is getting caught up in the sensual dimension of what he's writing and just taking an element, kind of like I like looking at Van Gogh because of what he does with yellow, right? Like I'm just paying attention to what he's doing with yellow, but I'm not actually experiencing the truth that's revealed in the work of art. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, Don Marshall.
Yes. So I'm looking at page 142 and 143, where he talks about Socrates and Plato's interest in Socrates, let's say. That Socrates really starts something new in philosophy.
Mhm.
And it's something that contrasts with the pre-Socratic attempt to grasp the universe as a coherent, organized totality. Okay. And everybody says Socrates asked instead the question about human being, about his own being, about self-understanding. And Gadamer says on 142 and 143 that here we get a new thread, interesting metaphor, a new thread woven into the cloth out of which the philosopher's mantle has been sewn. Okay. And that is this Socratic orientation toward practical wisdom that is not so interested in science, not so interested in trying to grasp the coherence of the natural world, but really wants to understand practical wisdom. And this strand has since run alongside the royal road of Western philosophy. And we will meet it again. He says, we will meet it again. And I think one of the things he's saying is that Socrates in the Phaedo, says, I was really interested in Anaximenes because they said, Anaxagoras, because he was interested in how things work, and he said mind was in control. And basically what Socrates wants to say is our understanding of the natural world has to be connected to the terms in which we understand our own practical activity. Both of them have to be oriented toward the good. And it's at that point that he takes his second start, the flight into the logoi. Okay. Now, I think what Gadamer says at the end of the essay is, and this is on page 149 at the bottom, the task of bringing people to self-understanding is something philosophy has done for a long time. And so has hermeneutics. Okay. And it's as though he's saying, because he does say from time to time, the collapse of metaphysics in the 19th century. And I'm very struck by that. Okay. But what he seems to want to say is, in many, practical philosophy emerges out of this. And practical philosophy and hermeneutics are very close to each other as the form philosophy needs to take now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Metaphysics is not the answer. We don't return to that. Practical philosophy and hermeneutics is what comes out. Okay. So I'm not sure exactly where we're going, but I think his conception is that philosophy has in fact changed.
Yeah.
It has its roots. It still has connections to its roots, but it has changed.
Yeah, great. I like that you brought us back to where we started too, the same sort of page and the issue that Eddie brought up in the beginning about an hour and 45 minutes ago. So Niall, go ahead. You're up.
That's great, Don. I was reminded that the centrality of phronesis and the phronimos and everything he's saying is really relevant here. And I was struck there's a very early essay by Gadamer on Aristotle's Protrepticus, in which he says that poetry and philosophy both give us good judgment, he says, right? So that's what they help us to get, you know. So the phronimos is both poetic and philosophical. So it's the person of good judgment that is the product of both art and philosophizing in some way. But he's clear that when it comes to an account of the phronimos and phronesis, what Aristotle gives us is a systematic account. So it's this idea of systematicity or the system, which is still this natural philosophical tendency that we have to put together a beginning, middle, and end account, which is itself not unscientific. So I see that tension, and I see this Heideggerian lineage in thinking possibility being higher than actuality, phronesis being higher than theoria. That's the type of philosophy I think Gadamer wants to get back to. But he's still committed to a type of systematic approach that would need to give an account of what good judgment is and who is the person of good judgment that is both poetically inclined and philosophically inclined. So that would be my tuppence worth.
Yeah. Thanks. Eric.
So Don, I wanted to get and Nell, I love what you were saying there too, obviously. But Don, I wanted to get back to where you said, okay, so we've lost, we can't go back to metaphysics. What we need to do is like practical philosophy, and like now you were just saying, like to rank it that way. But then if hermeneutics is the way to do it, I'm like, I've been running into all these issues where I'm so picking different texts to interpret, right? So I'm working in religious studies, looking at classic Buddhist literature and trying to like have fun interpreting it. I'm looking at ancient Jewish literature, right? And now I've been in an argument in teaching philosophy with a submission that I gave, trying to interpret Plato differently. And it feels like everybody's criticism is, but so if I say something like, can God ask a genuine question when God asked Adam and Eve, where are you? Right? So I'm just trying to have fun interpreting the text, but other people are like, obviously God is all knowing and can't ask genuine questions, right? So they're doing metaphysics about the nature of God when I'm trying to look at a story and have fun interpreting it. And so the collision of that kind of, right, like, so fine, Gadamer saying hermeneutics is the way to go to do philosophy, but the hegemony of professional philosophy is metaphysical, right? And so now it's a political contest, in that, like, the only way to make room for interpretive variations is you always have to fight metaphysical kind of hegemony in every contribution. When I'm like, that feels like such a waste of time. Can we just get to talking about this character in this narrative rather than having to talk about some omni being that exists, this transcendent entity that exists? You know what I mean? Don, am I making right? Like, so, I mean, anyway.
Yeah, we know what you mean, Eric. That makes perfect sense. All right, John Beach, go ahead.
Just a short one. I just had an insight, and I don't know whether it's thought through properly or not, but this is we always struggle with the relation between Gadamer and Heidegger, because Gadamer learned so much from Heidegger, and I think even more than Heidegger learned from Heidegger at times. But I mean, he thinks that he will not accuse Heidegger of inconsistency, that's for sure. But the what I find the difference is that Gadamer is not pretentious enough to second guess either Plato or Aristotle. And that's the difference with Heidegger, who is pretentious enough to do that. So that was my insight.
But John, like that, I love your point about like Gadamer is not pretentious enough to question Plato and Aristotle. Nevertheless, he's not pretentious enough. He is courageous enough to question the sedimented reception history of Plato, right? Like when
Yes,
it says something like Plato is the first anti-Platonist, like he's trying to get Plato right. But to be able to do that, you're having to argue with like thousands of years of people just repeating the same BS about Plato's forms or whatever it
yes,
is.
and I think Don Marshall expressed that very well, very articulately, and I totally and like I study a lot of philology and classical scholarship, like Japp Mansfield. These guys, like they are, right back to Diels and before. And the thing is, they strangely enough think that all truth comes from science. We've gotten over this philosophy stuff. They're philologists. They're doing their scholarship, and so there's a lot of anyway. Yeah, but Gadamer, the thing is, Gadamer, what makes Gadamer so different from all these people is that he will not divorce philosophy from theology. Didn't do it in the 20s, and he never did in his life, and that makes him unique from everybody else. So that was my okay.
John Arthos. I think we lost John Arthos there right when he was about to have lost.
Yeah, sorry.
Mario.
So I just wanted to bring it back to Eddie's astonishment at the text that he started out with, because I think that's right. And the theme that Gadamer starts to develop here is a theme, as I've said, that it occurs all through his work, right? And I put the link up to Facunda's translation of the essay. Hopefully that's accessible to you. And there's a phrase in there where and I'll translate it as an entirely systematically regulated existence. So Gadamer sees this as the crisis of our age, right? And he was writing this thing quite a while ago, but it seems to be more so than ever the case, right? So I guess I just would, I would press people to think about the relevance, the contemporaneity of this theme that Gadamer develops, all of the vocabulary that he develops for it, all the tools of analysis that he develops for it, this sort of the negative critique, but then also the positive response that he holds out as this. And Don, thank you for bringing that quotation to our attention about practical wisdom, which has since run alongside the royal road of Western philosophy, by which he means Western philosophy, metaphysics, science. We will meet up with it again. So that's hopeful. That's a hopeful gesture or hope that Gadamer has, that we will have to come back to this humanist way of learning at some point.
Great, thanks. Jay Goulding. You may be muted, Jay. We may have to.
Okay.
There you go.
Somehow got muted. Really enjoying the conversation. I was going to pick up on a point that John Beach was making that's very good, that Gadamer is unique and he carries the tensions between philosophies and theologies and other things. And it's something of the last couple of decades I've been working on Schelling, and this is where Gadamer is still heard in Schelling study circles because of those tensions. Because when Schelling was writing in the 1840s, philosophy was third on the list to theology and theosophy. So some of those debates are being brought up, so that what Gadamer calls the potence is drawing from Schelling, the potency of self-consciousness that he talks about in this book is being brought into play. So I just wanted to add that and underscore what John Beach was saying. I was going to ask John a question. Are you in any way related to a person called Ned Beach?
I'm there's well, you ask Ned if he's descended from one of the John, Richard, or Thomas. There were three members of the original New Haven colony, and that
Oh.
way we'll know. He'll
You
know
might be
Okay,
for
related,
sure.
but
all right. Well,
going 300, 400
I will
years
do
back.
that. I was just going to add in that I kind of faintly remembered John from the past because you did the Gadamer classes at McMaster, John Beach.
Yes,
Were
that
you
was
the
me.
guy in the corner with the tape recorder? I was just going to
Yes,
do that.
Yes.
Yes.
Those tapes exist.
Anyway,
I got all
he
those
was the
tapes.
guy in
Yeah,
the corner with the tape recorder. Glad to see you. And
yeah.
thank you very
All
much.
right. And Gadamer wanted to take me back to Heidelberg. He said, "You got to get out of here, man. They don't understand what you're doing at all." They let him go after 3 years. They wouldn't renew his contract. And I said, he wanted me to write on the concept of time and music. And
Oh,
I knew I wasn't gonna have a career in the academic world. I wasn't interested in it. So I knew I was gonna have to become financially independent. So I turned him down. But he wrote me a letter when he was 101 years old, which I have pinned on the wall. But no, I had a very close relationship with Gadamer. It was amazing.
well, we'll talk about that in the future. I was going to say I did the tour with Richard Palmer of China when Gadamer said I can't. I'm not taking any more intercontinental flights or anything. But anyway, good to see you.
Yeah, great. Yeah, great. Well, email me. Do that.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, we only have a couple minutes left. Is there anything that got overlooked? Any choice quotes that either inspired you or confused you, or any themes that you feel like it would just be a gross disappointment if our discussion ended and this didn't get mentioned? Yes, Henry. Henry, are
I
you
think
muted?
Er-
There you go.
yeah, I think Eric has his hand up first, so maybe I'll let him go.
Thanks, Henry. And I just wanted to point to the very last sentence that like self-knowledge alone is capable of saving freedom threatened not only by all rulers, capitalism, but much more by the domination and dependence that issue from everything we think we control. So, right, like I've been in these circles where like they're always constantly saying the reason why things suck is because of capitalism. And I love that Gadamer like says, yes, capitalism is a problem, but it's really our kind of compulsive need to control things that is preventing us from living the good life. That's all.
Yep.
Thanks, Henry.
Great. All right, Henry.
Yeah, I have something like very open-ended. So like since this was written in 1970s, and now we have like cognitive science and all this neuroscience that are like trying to provide some sort of like on self-understanding. Like or maybe it's a kind of self-mastery. I'm not sure like what we should characterize that with. So I'm just like trying to think about like how like maybe Gadamer would respond to that. And yeah, like because like especially in the last part of the essay, right? Like he wants to highlight how like self-understanding is an important part. And now even like the positive or the natural science are trying to like create a narrative of like self-understanding in a different way, right? So maybe like, or maybe like Gadamer would say like, this is not a correct way of self-understanding. So I'm just wondering if like people have some strong opinions on that.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's very open-ended, but I can see the point and relevance of it. So do people have thoughts about that, about whether there's now a kind of self-understanding? Don, go ahead.
So I just want to ask a question as long as I have these students of Gadamer all gathered, very much in Henry's. Do you know an essay where Gadamer explains what he means by self-understanding? Silence.
No, it's
He
in
uses
it's in
this term a
philosophical
lot, but
hermeneutics. It's
what-
in the collection of essays.
It's the problem of self-understanding. Yeah. But I don't know if he explains it there.
Okay. And that one explains what self-understanding is. What
The
is it
free
to,
buoyancy of the self above itself, right? Where he says like the self in play, we lose ourselves, and that's how we become ourselves.
well, I will be happy to look at that again, but Here, self-understanding seems to be taken mainly negatively. That is, to understand yourself means you are not a god. You are limited.
Right.
You are finite.
Opposite of
Is
hubris.
that
I
what
just-
self-understanding means? Self-understanding means the realization of your own finitude. Is that okay?
Yeah.
That's
the
good
neurotic-
self-understanding. Yeah. There's
Mhm.
bad self-understanding too.
Well,
Yeah.
Okay.
this goes back to your concerns about AI, right? Because the wonderful sections in Truth and Method about how Gadamer defines experience. The experienced person is someone who knows that they don't know, right? And so, the whole model of AI is predictive, right?
Right.
It's designed to create predictions, and Gadamer and the Phronimos is someone who knows that the future is not predictable. And so the wisdom of
Right.
experience is the wisdom of the person who knows his own lack of knowledge.
And is therefore open to new experience.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's good.